As I mentioned earlier, we have a presentation by Mr. Marty Roesch, Vice President and Chief Architect for Cisco and the Security Business Group. He joined Cisco through the acquisition of SourceFire, a company he founded in 2001. His experience goes back really in our space to the mid-90s, where he was working NSA and with DISA, and in founding of his company, continued to work in the technology and the engineering introduction and the build-out of capabilities important to those two agencies. He was the CTO at SourceFire and a member of the board of directors. He is, in his current position, he is responsible for shaping the technology strategy. Having been in the business of understanding and building and engineering the solutions, he is now involved a lot with the shaping the technology strategy and design of Cisco's comprehensive security portfolio. And he also oversees threat research, including the Talos Security Intelligence and Research Group. Mr. Roesch has received a host of awards for his technology innovation and vision. Most recently, he was recognized as one of the top 25, this is good, disruptors of 2013. We know that's a powerful term. This was awarded to him by CRN Magazine for the value his innovations provide partners and customers, and was earlier selected as one of eWeek's top 100 most influential people in IT. I really believe you're in for a treat and a great presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome for Mr. Marty Roesch.
Thanks very much. All right, good morning, everyone. It's still morning. Feels like it's afternoon. I drove through DC traffic this morning to get here, so down from Maryland, so it does feel like I've already been up and around for quite a while today. So today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about going towards effective security, which is the title of this presentation, but you know, it's really kind of something that's very much on my mind these days, because in my role as the chief architect for the security business group at Cisco, this has become something that's very pervasive in all the discussions that I have about what people need in security today and how they need to or want to and need to do security. So we're going to talk a little bit about this and kind of give you my perspective. And my perspective has really evolved a lot over the past few years. So if we can go to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about some perspective about what's going on in security right now. So I've been working in security for about 20 years. And I got my start working as a government contractor, doing stuff for DISA and for the NSA, as you heard, and kind of working on security contracts. And I was very quickly drawn into kind of the interesting technological side of the security world. So I got started with that. About 2 years after I started doing security work, I started writing this little program that I called Snort, and it quickly snowballed into kind of what I like to call this accidental empire. And a couple years after I started writing Snort, I started this little company called SourceFire, and SourceFire took off as well. And then we were acquired by Cisco about 2.5 years ago for something on the tune of close to $3 billion. So that's pretty good, a nice success story. But it's also a really interesting story from a perspective standpoint, because the journey that I personally have had to get to where I am now it's really informed me. And I've been thinking about this a lot more lately, because I've been talking to audiences like this a lot more lately about kind of where security has been and where it needs to be. So if you look at kind of my progression, when I started writing Snort. Lots of people use Snort. Snort's a very handy tool. It does a lot of cool things. And it's become the foundation of a lot of different security programs, and especially in the detection and response phase. But as Snort kind of got rolling, I realized how popular it had become. What I found was that I thought there would be a market for being able to scale Snort. And so I started SourceFire. And SourceFire originally was all about, hey, let's build scalable Snort infrastructures, and we're going to sell this thing that's free. And I've got a business model that I think people are actually going to be interested in paying for it. And that worked out, despite a lot of people saying it would never work. It worked out actually pretty well. So we got going with SourceFire, and it was all about scaling. Hey, we're going to scale Snort, make it manageable, make it scalable, make it perform, make it supported and automate it and things like that. And eventually we got into more stuff, next generation firewalls and advanced malware protection and things like that. So it was a good, good path, and we built an integrated system. Everything kind of worked together, and it all, one engineering team that worked very tightly together to build an integrated solution. So I thought, we were pretty hot. And then we got acquired by Cisco, and we came in the door at Cisco, and we're like, hey, we're pretty hot. We're gonna, come in here, and we're gonna help you do security better, and we're all gonna, be one big happy family. But a funny thing happened to me when this acquisition happened. I expected, hey, $3 billion deal, I'm going to make out pretty well. Obviously, we're a public company, so I didn't get $3 billion, but I did okay, right? So I'm like, hey, time to go to the beach. And they're like, oh, no. We need a chief architect to make all this stuff work together. And you're that guy. You're going to be the chief architect, and you're going to figure out how to get Cisco's entire portfolio to work together and give us an architecture for security. So I said, okay, that sounds interesting. Let's do this. And off to the races we went. So I've been working in strategy and architecture and vision for Cisco now for about 2.5 years. And we've done some pretty interesting things. We made this big pivot. Previously, Cisco was more of a control-centric security company. And control-centric security is kind of all the old standbys of security, of structuring your environment, firewalls and VPNs and access control systems and identity management systems and patch and vulnerability management, things like that. All about structuring your environment, right? Make it hard to break into in the first place. If we do a good job of that, then the bad guys won't be able to get in. But we know that doesn't work 100% anymore. You have to be able to deal with the eventuality that you are going to face attacks that your structured environment can't deal with. You will be breached. So Cisco decided that they needed to make the pivot to threat-centric security, and that's what we were all about at my company. So threat-centric security is really about doing security in terms of being able to maintain the operational integrity of the environment that we're protecting. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at a lot of the security world that's out there, a lot of the systems that are out there and how they work and operate and things like that, what you'll find is they work great as long as you don't get broken into. Like, how does the crypto system work? Works great, right? We encrypt the drives, we encrypt the network connections, we encrypt everything, and that all works great right up to the point that somebody breaks into a system that's a key component of this crypto system, whether it's an endpoint in an encrypted stream or something that's got encrypted data on it. And once they can set up shop and start key logging and grab your keys and do all the other stuff, how does that system work? Well, it doesn't work very well at all. Right? It doesn't work, it really doesn't work, period. From an attacker's standpoint, it doesn't do anything. From a defender's standpoint, they probably don't have the skills to break into that data if they really needed to, right? You want to see how good your crypto is, lose your keys. But from an attacker's standpoint, they're in, right? And once an attacker can control the operation of your CPU, what the contents of your RAM, how your network is utilized, you got a problem, right? You've got a big problem. So threat-centric security is all about understanding that and then doing something about it. So this is what I've really been into for a very long time, and this is the transition that I've made kind of in my day job is working to move the company and working to bring together one way of doing security. Because security has really changed. Can I get the next slide? Security has really changed, right? The problem that we have today is threats. I mean, we've got a lot of problems, right? We've got compliance issues, and we've got all these different standards that we have to adhere to, and all these other things. But our day-to-day problem is really getting broken into, having an attacker establish a presence that has a long loiter time, and doing whatever they want to do, and being very hard to get out. The longer they're in, the harder they are to get out. The problem that we have today is threats. If you cannot maintain the integrity of your operating environment, you don't get to do security. Being flippant, I say, this is why we can't have nice things. So this is the world that we live in today, and it takes a lot of different tools to do the job of trying to make these things work together, and there's a lot of different paths to trying to be secure. So what I'm trying to do in my role, having transitioned from being really fundamentally low-level technologist to being somebody who's got a much broader purview and a much broader set of responsibility, is come up with an architecture, an integrated set of capabilities to be able to deal with the world that we live in today. Can you get the next slide? Because the hacker economy has gotten absolutely massive. If we look at the size of the hacker economy, it's about 3 to 5 times the size of the security industry. I'm really fascinated right now by ransomware. Because ransomware is, it's not exactly new, but it's taking off. This is like, it's almost like it's hitting a hockey stick like you see in startups when a market materializes and emerges and all of a sudden you have this explosive growth. Why is this happening with ransomware? Because it's easy time to money for a bad guy, right? It's not break into a site, gather a bunch of information, gather a bunch of PII, front it somehow through dark nets, get your secondary streams involved and things like that. This is, your computer's locked up, pay me right now, and I'll unlock it for you. Do you think that's attractive to attackers? Yes, it's very attractive to attackers. This is, time to value for an attacker. So you're starting to see this rapid evolution in ransomware right now. And this is going to be a huge market for the bad guys. Effective ransomware that can spread itself, that can pervasively infect an enterprise and extract maximum value. We're starting to see the first signs of that. We're starting to see that happen. I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. But this is what's happening, right? We've seen the industrialization of hacking, just like we've seen the industrialization of the security industry, going from kind of point solutions and kind of bespoke solutions in a lot of environments to really broad infrastructures and these large scalable systems and things like that. We're seeing the same sorts of things happen in hacking right now. I've been talking about this for a while. The industrialization of hacking is very bad for us, for people who don't want to get hacked, because now we're talking about essentially having assembly line hacking where we break into a site, we exploit our points of presence in there, we exploit our access to the environment, and we monetize it as quickly as possible in a lot of cases. And then, of course, you have the nation state side of the world, which is even worse in a lot of ways because they're extracting intellectual property or straight up secrets that are obviously better kept inside. So next slide. So Cisco does this thing called the ASR, the Annual Security Review, every year, and we actually do it twice a year. We do an annual security review and a mid-year security review, which is kind of interesting. But what we do is we go out and we survey our customers, and we ask them a different set of questions every year. And because Cisco has a very large customer base, we get a large sample set back, which is actually pretty nice. So this year's was pretty interesting, and it was interesting because what we're seeing is that the awareness of attacking, of compromise, has become so pervasive that it's actually starting to erode people's confidence that they can do anything about the security problem at all in the first place, right? Only 59% are confident in having the latest technology. 45% have strong confidence in their ability to scope and contain an attack. Less than half say, geez, if we get broken into, we have a series of things that we know to do about it. We have the tools and the capabilities, people, process, procedures to get these guys contained and back out. It's an interesting world that we're living in right now. People are becoming aware, and they're also becoming aware of the inadequacy of their tool sets in a lot of ways, or they're becoming aware of the limitations of the approach to security that they've chosen to do. So this is really a very interesting set of data, and actually if you read through the annual security report, some of the data gets even more interesting. There's the data set that we had last year was showing that the level of confidence that you had in your capability to detect and respond to attacks in a lot of organization dropped off dramatically as you got down the food chain. So the CIOs were like, yeah, everything's great. But the guys in operations were like, we're teetering on the edge. And if we get really hit badly, we're going to have a very bad time, right? There was a vast drop-off in the amount of confidence as you got down to the people who actually knew what was going on. So it's, once again, it's a fascinating time that we're in right now. Next slide, please. So this is a question that I've been asking people for a while now, for about 5 years now, and I think it's really, I think it's a good question. And the reason that I still ask it is because I think it helps to change how people think. Now, with the awareness of the level of threat that we face today, and the awareness of the kinds of consequences that we're facing in the wake of an attack, I think it's a great question because I think a lot of people still think in terms of, well, we're just going to structure our environment, we'll prevent the attackers from getting in, and everything's going to be great. That's not right. If you come under a concentrated attack, if an attacker really wants to get into your site, what do you think the chances of being able to repel that attacker in an organization of any size are? It's roughly 0, right? I'm not going to query the room. I'm pretty sure you know the answer is roughly 0. So if you knew you were going to be compromised, if you knew you were going to be broken into, what would you be doing to deal with that? Would you change the systems you're running? Would you change the technologies that you use? Would you have a more focus on response and less on prevention and straight up protection of the environment? I mean, all these disciplines are important, but if we know we're going to be compromised, we should be thinking differently about the tool sets that we're deploying, and we should be thinking differently about where our center of mass of our security operations should be, what we should be focused on, how much we should focus on it, how much resources, manpower, and dollars that we should throw at these various areas of security. So when you start thinking about security this way, it starts to become very important to think about what you've got. Next slide, please. Because what you've got is going to really depend or really determine how able you are to respond to an attack. We know if we looked at the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, or we look at some of the other reports that are out there, we know the average amount of time that it takes for an attacker to land an exploit, assuming it works, is a few seconds. The amount of time that it takes them to start monetizing, start extracting value from your networked environment is usually on the order of a few hours. We know if that initial attack is missed, the amount of time that it takes to detect them is usually measured with a calendar. It's hundreds of days in many cases, in most cases. So this is a little Cisco marketing here, but it's important to understand. This timeliness factor is a huge deal. And we as an industry have known about this since at least 2010. In 2010, when Google got hacked, when we all started talking about APTs, this should have been a big red flag in the air. Hey, timeliness counts, and it counts for a lot. We used to look at the Verizon Data Breach Investigations reports. If you look at them all the way going back, we see these long, long time frames that attackers are active in environments. But then when we start thinking about advanced persistent threats and all the things that means, and we start thinking about these attack timelines, and we start thinking about what an attacker can do if they have the ability to loiter in your environment for long periods of time, timeliness is utterly critical. In my role at Cisco, I'm not just the chief architect, but I also run the threat research team at the company. We're very focused on this, like time to response, time to detection, time to develop and deliver content so people can protect themselves against new threats. It's absolutely critical. It doesn't do you any good to have an intrusion prevention system or an advanced malware protection system that's driven by content if the content's not up to date. What I mean by content, your snort rules are content, right? You've got snort, which is an engine, then you've got the content that makes snort do something interesting, which is the rules. So we've been driving very hard to reduce this time to detection. I'm not trying to so much market this as just tell you where the important things lie. Like, how fast can you go from, ooh, we've just figured out a new bad thing is out there, to having content available? 7 or 8 months ago at Cisco, it was about 46 hours. 2 months ago, it was about 17 hours. We're working on driving that number down. When I got to Cisco a couple years ago, it was probably a month, something like that. So we've been driving this number down pretty quickly, especially lately, because we've been developing more advanced processes and procedures for being able to deal with it. And this is important, obviously, because we cannot allow bad guys to have long loiter time. We saw this warning come out from the FBI, what was that, a couple weeks ago? They're reporting on a network that's been broken into since 2011. What do you think the opportunity for getting those guys back out is going to be? Probably your best bet is to take all the computers and all the networking gear and rent a dumpster and put it all in it, and then get new stuff, right? What do you think their ability to hide backdoor accesses in graphics cards, in network cards, in all these secondary processors that are floating around in your devices, all this firmware that's out there? They have immense opportunity to do this, right? So next slide, please. So we see the problem out there, and we see kind of what's required to deal with it as well. And I think one of the other big important pieces is that you've got to stop treating everything as an island. And what do I mean by that? So I obviously been working in this space for a long time. This is all data from our threat research team that we have that works for me at Cisco. And what I've seen over the years, and what I know this audience talks a lot about, is information sharing and intel sharing, threat data sharing, and things like that. We've got a lot of threat intel vendors out there now. We've got a lot of threat intel services and things like that. And all this stuff is really important. It's great to have. But what we really need to do, and what a lot of these efforts are focused towards, is getting out of this kind of island mode of operating. The way that security has been done for a very long time is everything is an island. Every customer is an island. I think about it from a customer's perspective, right? Every customer is an island. Every organization, every unit, every enterprise, they're all islands. They have kind of their view of the world, they have their infrastructure, they have their defensive posture, they have their tools, they have their configurations, and they're kind of out there by themselves. We're getting to the point now, via threat intel sharing and things like that, where we can start disseminating information to different people. And the level that we're at now in a lot of cases is, I've got my event analytics screen up here, and I've got my threat intel feed up over here, and I take, here's an event, oh, who's that guy? And I look him up over here, and then I say, oh, how much do I care about this event based on how bad the data is coming out of this threat intel stuff? That's really not good enough, right? We need to be much faster than that. We need to be much more precise than that. So the guys that work for me at Cisco, we look through about 100 terabytes of security-relevant information every day to generate data. The data sets that we see are absolutely tremendous. We see about 2% of the world's DNS traffic through our OpenDNS acquisition that we did last year. Through all of our cloud properties, if you look across our advanced malware protection, our email protection, our web security stuff, we see we're blocking about close to 20 billion threats a day. To put that in human terms, we're blocking about 3 threats per human being on planet Earth per day through these systems. We're bringing all this data together, right? 1.1 million unique samples of malware a day that we're sandboxing and distilling and extracting information from about who they like to talk to, what they look like, what their software looks like, what the domains they like to go to are, and things like that. So we're looking through this data every day. And we're not just doing it so we can also have threat intel, right? We generate lists of IP reputation, URL, DNS, file reputation, things like that. That's not the end game. What we're really trying to do is we're getting to a system where, yes, we can decorate the events in our analytics displays and things like that, so you can see, here's an event that happened, and the guy who hit me was a bad guy, and it's all automatic. You don't have 2 screens for it. That's great. But what we're really working on is making sure that our customers aren't islands. Right? So that if you get hit, we all know about it, not directly that you got hit, but we know who it was that hit you, so that we can all be cognizant of it, but also working on ways to automatically distribute that information throughout our infrastructure, so that as soon as we know about it, the global we know about it, everybody gets protected as fast as possible. It's not good enough to publish a list of known bad actors on the internet and then use that as a cross-reference in an event analytics display. If we know these guys are bad, everything that's capable of stopping them, from an IP reputation, URL, DNS, file reputation, everything that's capable of stopping them should do so automatically without you having to do anything about it. You shouldn't have to touch any buttons to make it happen. Because speed's important, because accuracy is important, because waiting for, we were going to update the IP reputation list, but we were outside of a maintenance window, so we couldn't get the change requests in time, and we had to wait 2 weeks to get the latest in there, and they ran away with, something important. That's not good enough. It's not good enough for you, and it's not good enough for me either, right? So I'm one of these guys who's saying what we should build and how we should build it and things like that. We want all this stuff, all this massive data set that we've got. We want this to go out to the stuff that we make as quickly as possible. We even share a lot of it, right? These are the guys who build the snort rules. So as soon as we have snort rules created, 3 times a week, there's another release of snort rules, and we do emergency releases when new stuff comes out, so on and so forth. All right, next slide. So this is kind of the world that we're living in now, where we're trying to make our security, our users not be islands anymore, but we're also trying to make our technologies not be islands anymore. Because in a lot of cases, what you have is you have security technologies that are individually configured and individually deployed, and they have no knowledge of what's going on around them, right? They're only as good as their operations team that keeps them up to date and manages them from a day-to-day basis. So, given all of that, let's talk about a better model for attacking the problem space that we have today. So, one of the tools that I've actually been using for a long time is this thing that I call an attack continuum. And the attack continuum came about in the very early days of SourceFire. And the reason that I created it was because, quite frankly, we'd gone from 4 people to about 50 people in 8 months. And what I found was that when I said security, different people heard different things based on where they had come from. We were hiring salespeople and engineers and marketing people and operations people and stuff like that. And many of them had come from industry, and many of them had not come from industry. And they all had different conceptions about what security was and what it did and where it came from and how it was delivered. So I came up with a model so that we could have a level playing field for talking about security technologies internally. And what I found was that as I went out and started talking to people who use this stuff day to day, who have all these tools, who get engaged by sales teams in many cases, what I found was that people really had no idea what the heck it was they were actually running, like in terms of the gear they had deployed and what it was built to do and what it wasn't built to do, what the scope of these technologies were. So I brought this, I brought this out, and so we started talking about it in public. So when we came to Cisco and we became part of Cisco, I brought it in here and I said, hey, look, this is how we think about security technologies and products and operations, and maybe we should think about it this way here. And much to my surprise, it was adopted very broadly inside Cisco. So this is how we talk about it. Let me take you through the model really quickly. So this thing is all about threat-centric security. If you're doing threat-centric security, this is one model that I believe is very effective for kind of describing what's going on from both a task and functional standpoint as well as from a technology standpoint. So the game here is pretty straightforward. I'm going to be the IT security guy. I'm going to take off my chief architect hat, and I'm going to put on my IT security guy hat. And I'm going to think about protecting my network from the bad guys. Well, how do I think about that? Now, when you talk to a lot of vendors, what they'll do is they'll show you their security cycle, right? I'm sure if you walk out there, you can pick up a bunch of glossies and you'll see everybody's security cycle. It'll be 3 or 4 like round balls, and they'll have words in them, and they'll have arrows between them, and they're like, this is the security cycle, and it's like an OODA loop, or it's like something that came out of NIST, or it'll look very familiar to you in a lot of ways. I think those are mostly nonsense, and for a lot of reasons. I think this model works pretty well because all this stuff happens asynchronously, continuously, in real time, and they all overlap with each other. That's the reality of it, right? This is how security actually works. So how do we do security in a threat-centric model? Well, essentially, if I'm the guy whose job it is to deal with this stuff, I think about it in 3 basic phases: before an attacker shows up, during an attack, and after I've been compromised. In every phase, I have different tools that I'm going to use to accomplish different tasks. So what do I do before an attacker shows up? What's my job? Make it hard to break into my network in the first place, right? Pretty straightforward. Hey, how about if we made it hard to break in here before we do anything else? So how are we going to do that? Well, first we're going to discover the environment, right? Figure out what the heck we're running, because if we don't know what we're running, we're not going to do a very good job of protecting it. It's going to be very hard to deploy security technologies and configure it appropriately. Then I'm going to enforce my policies, deploy my access controls. I'm going to harden my assets and get them into a known good configuration, or at least an understood configuration. And I have a bunch of different tools I'm going to use to do this: firewalls and app control and VPN, patch management, vulnerability management, identity and access management. Chances are if it's got management in its name, it's probably a before technology. Crypto goes in this bucket as well. This is not a comprehensive list, obviously. There's only 15 things up here. This is all the stuff that would fit on a PowerPoint slide. So this is what we do before an attacker shows up, and it's all about brokering access between users, applications, data, and devices, and making sure everything is configured the way that it should be configured to give us a safe operating environment. And these technologies are absolutely critical, despite the fact that in the face of an attacker, they generally become irrelevant from an attacker's standpoint once they've broken in. These are the tools that we're going to use to get them back out. When we recognize that the bad guy is there, we're going to use these tools to get them back out. So these technologies work great, right up to the point that you suffer a compromise, because very frequently these technologies, how do they actually go about brokering access between users, apps, data, and devices? They do it with credentialed access, right? You got your username and your password, or maybe your 2-factor authentication or one-time password system or something like that. So what is the first thing an attacker goes after? He goes after the credentialing system. And once they're inside of that, they have free reign through most of the technologies in the before column. So this happens, and it's okay, because we have other technologies to deal with that eventuality. So the next phase is during. Now I'm under attack. What do I do? Well, I at least want to detect the presence of an attacker. And if I'm in a position to do so and I can describe the attack concisely enough, I would like to block it. So different set of tools: IPS, antivirus, email and web security gateways, reputation systems, things like that. These technologies do a very good job. Once again, they're excellent technologies. If they are configured appropriately, attackers will have a very hard time getting through them unless they use an attack that nobody's seen before, or they use a vector that's not being covered by the technologies, right? All your technology doesn't work very well if somebody waltzes in with a USB key, or some guy down in operations puts up a wireless access point so he can watch ESPN.com while he's having lunch on the bench outside the office or something like that, right? So this is kind of the reality that we live in here. This stuff works great right up to the point that it doesn't work, and at the point that it doesn't work, it fails completely for the most part, and it also fails silently. Your IPS doesn't tell you about the 50 million flows it saw today that it thought were A-OK. It only tells you about the stuff that it thought was bad. And if that's the case, then if it misses something, you're going to get exactly 0 notification of it. And then we have the after phase. Now we've been broken into. Now we're in the, so what are you going to do differently phase. If you knew you were going to be broken into, now you're in the after phase. So in the after phase, what do? We scope it, figure out where it is, what tools they're using, how they're communicating. We contain it, shut down the lines of communication, make sure they can't reinfect or spread laterally, and then we remediate it. We clean it up and get it out. Different set of tools for that. AMD is advanced malware detection. That's like sandboxing and reputation, file reputation, and behavioral analysis of files. FPC is full packet capture, so all your packet logging stuff. IDS, forensics, log management, SIM, network behavioral analytics kind of goes in this phase as well. So this is the world that we have today, and this is a very network-centric viewpoint. But what you really need to understand about this model is that it's all about scope. Your technologies have the thing that they were built to do, and they have everything else. There's a thing that they were built to do that's core to their scope. There's a secondary functionality of stuff that they can do, and it'll be OK. And then there's a tertiary functionality of things that they could do, but they're probably not very good at it. So like when people come to me and they say, hey, Marty, can Snort be a data leak prevention system? And I go, it could be, but I don't know why you do that, because it's not really built to do that. And it won't perform very well, right? There's lots of technologies like that. And what happens very frequently is that people don't understand what the fundamental scope, what the core functionality of their products is, and when they've transitioned into the secondary and tertiary functionalities. Because very frequently, quite frankly, as an industry and as an industry guy, you'll be sold whatever you need, right? Oh, it needs to have, speed flaps on it? Sure, it's an intrusion prevention system. Of course it's got speed flaps. These things happen all over the place. And what happens is people get very confused about what they've bought and what its capabilities are, and where those capabilities tail off dramatically and where they end. So it's important to keep these things in mind. And if you look at your security technologies and you think about them, especially the stuff that's built for dealing with threats, what you'll find is they actually map pretty well, in a lot of cases, to the 3 buckets here, the before, during, and after. And we use this thing back at SourceFire all the time. We used it to figure out who our partners versus competitors were. We used it to think about what we should be building versus what we should be thinking about buying. We used it to figure out how our competitors overlapped with us and things like that. It's a very useful and effective model, and I think it's still pretty useful today. But this is a very network-centric viewpoint of it. Can I get the next slide, please? You don't have to just do this on the network. You have to do this everywhere where a bad guy can show up, right? On the network, endpoint, mobile, virtual, and in the cloud. So it's a big, big problem. I put 15 technologies up on screen there. If you need 15 of them across every potential threat vector, what's that going to look like? Well, it's kind of going to look like what we've got today in the security industry, right? Can I get the next slide, please? Today we're into this kind of really interesting period in the world of security. So I've been doing this for about 20 years, and back when I got started, there were a much, much smaller number of vendors and smaller number of solutions that are out there today. I gave a keynote at RSA back in February, or maybe it was March, back in February, and it was really interesting because there were 500 vendors on the show floor, 500, and that was about a third of the security industry represented there. There's about 1,500 security vendors worldwide today. Do you think they are delivering 1,500 different ways of doing security? I don't think so. I'm pretty sure they're not. They're developing 1,500 ways of doing security that have tons and tons of overlap that may only be incrementally better or maybe it's just a few features on top of an existing capability, or a few features to be used on top of an existing capability. And this is what happens in a lot of cases, right? The state of security today is that we've got a lot of things out there that are just incremental features on top of existing capabilities that really aren't getting us a lot of bang for our buck. And for that incremental capability, we get a ton of complexity. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you look at a lot of the systems that are out there today, take host-based defenses and malware defense. Like take antivirus. Antivirus, despite the fact that it is kind of a much maligned field of security, antivirus provides a fundamental set of capabilities that are pretty useful and effective. But it doesn't do everything, and it has some kind of nasty failure modes. So we've seen the emergence of a lot of anti-malware solutions that provide incremental capabilities on top of that, right? So your AV system starts missing stuff, so you go get an advanced malware system that does reputation, and that works pretty well. But it still misses stuff, so I go out and I buy a sandbox, and that works pretty well. But I'm still missing stuff, so I get into file behavioral analytics or user behavioral analytics to look at the activities on systems, and that works pretty well. But I got a lot of fundamental capability with the AV system. Then on top of that, I've brought a little bit more, a little bit more, and a little bit more. And what else came with that incremental capability? A management platform, a language for describing what good and bad look like to this system, an event stream that may or may not be consumed by anything that you've got, and a reporting system for this one problem of figuring out which files are bad on my system. Do you think this happens on the network too? Yep, sure does. So this is kind of the world that we're in today. And if you go to the next slide, we started calling this at Cisco, for marketing reasons, the security effectiveness gap. But let's talk about this in real terms. This is a part of my presentation I gave at RSA this year. And what I was originally going to talk about at RSA was basically detection taxonomies and response taxonomies and kind of how they go together and how they don't go together. But I was putting together this presentation, and I started thinking about the old throwaway, hey, complexity is the enemy of security. And I sat down and I started thinking about what that really meant. And I decided, being the good engineer, to start kind of playing around with the math of the thing, talking about kind of the math of complexity versus the math of capability. And I came up with a graph. Can we hit the next slide? I think this is a build. So first off, let's talk about capabilities. OK, we'll just do this first one and then hold. So first off, we're going to talk about capabilities. Capabilities are brought to us by security technologies, products, platforms, and things like that. And what we see happening in the security world is that your initial few acquisitions, you get a lot of bang for your buck. You get a tremendous amount of capability for these platforms. So it's your next-gen firewall, and your host-based defense system, and your event analytics system, and so on and so forth. A lot of bang for the buck. And then you get incremental on top of that. Right? So, I need a little bit more, and I need a different way of looking at this, and I need some more stuff to find attackers who are wearing hats and things like that. So we do all these things, and we end up with a capability curve that rapidly flattens out. It starts to plateau. But what does my complexity look like? Well, I've got two types of complexity in security systems. I've got complexity of managing the security technology, kind of the security engineering, and then I've got the complexity of analyzing the data that it produces. So we'll put these on the X and the Y axes. Management complexity, analytics complexity. Well, management complexity scales, if I've got 5 security platforms, management's kind of orthogonal, right? So like the policy configuration, they don't really influence each other very much. So you get about 5x the amount of complexity for dealing with 5 platforms. But what about the analytics? If I have 5 different sets of security data, am I just going to have 5x the problem of analyzing them? Or am I going to start trying to do data fusion, bringing all these things together, bringing in external threat feeds, enriching this data every way that I can, running it through all these different modeling systems and things like that? Yeah, you bet I am. So what happens to the complexity of the analytics? Well, they expand geometrically. If you hit the next build, it starts to look a lot like this. This is the world that we're in today, right? Once you hit that point of diminishing returns, then you're into a mode where bringing in additional security technology compounds the complexity of the environment that you're dealing with much more than it brings capabilities to the table. And we see this happening in the real world. We've seen it happen. There's a great case in retail. I'm not going to name names, where they had all the bells and whistles. They had the sandboxes and the NGFWs and the IPSs and the antivirus systems and everything. They had the whole catalog. They were PCI compliant. Everything was great. They got hacked. They detected that they were hacked. And despite the fact that they detected that they were hacked, they did nothing until the fraud prevention systems started going off and everything started dialing back to, hey, can't help but notice all this credit card fraud we've been seeing over the last 30 days maps back to people who have interacted with you. The intersection set is exactly 1. So you guys got a big problem. And then they started looking around and they're like, oh man, well, we detected this. The fact of the matter was, despite the fact that they had all the stuff they were supposed to have, they still got hacked. I still had to have one of my credit cards personally replaced because these guys couldn't deal with the complexity of their environment. That's the reality that we have today. So we've got to deal with this. Next slide, please. My job is to figure out ways to deal with this, right? I build this stuff for a living. I'm one of the slimy vendors, but I'm one of the guys who fundamentally is trying to put this stuff together in ways that are addressable and accessible by the users, by you, because it does you no good, and it's not intellectually honest for me to ignore this forever. I can't do it. We have to get into something that at least looks like this. I'd really like that complexity curve to flatten out even more. Because if we can't do that, then we can't keep building stuff. There's no reason to keep building stuff if you can't possibly deal with it. At Cisco, we grow in a lot of ways by acquiring companies. We've done 5 product company acquisitions in the last 3 years at Cisco. We spent almost $4 billion. If we can't address this problem, eventually it's going to be, we're going to grind to a halt. So we need to come up with better solutions for this. And the way that you attack this, so I've got the step function that defines complexity, so I shrink the step function, or I increase the capability curve. I have fewer products that have more capabilities. I have fewer boxes that do more stuff. So how are we going to go about this? Next slide. We're going to keep it simple. What do I need to do? Well, it's 3 basic things. I need to integrate my technologies together and make them interoperate in ways that are lend themselves to more efficiency and more effectiveness. I need to consolidate. I need to have fewer things that do more stuff so that they are accessible, so that they are comprehensible. And I need to automate. I need to come up with ways to get these things to start doing their own work. If we're depending on operations teams and human brains to manage the complexity of the systems that we're bringing to bear, we're fooling ourselves. We've got to automate. So, we do this sort of stuff kind of naturally in a lot of ways, right? Integration is something, you look at all the things that we've acquired over the last couple of years, the amount of integration that's happened over the last few years is actually pretty amazing where I work, right? We've brought in, 5 companies, and they're actually all interoperating in ways that are actually pretty meaningful today. So these sorts of things are happening. We're consolidating. I know that you guys, don't eagerly await Cisco Magazine every month to figure out what's going on in Marty's world and what's happening in the security business group at Cisco. But we've been working very diligently to have fewer things that do more stuff. We're building hardware platforms that run our entire security suite. We're working on building one central manager that can manage all of our security platforms so that you don't go get 7 different security technologies from us and have 7 different UIs for managing them, which in the past you would have. And we're working on automation. And automation is a big problem. This is a huge problem because automation requires a different type of technology and a different approach to attacking security. Can I get the next slide? Hopefully it's on the next slide. Yes. What we're working towards is this thing that we call the integrated threat defense architecture. And I'm not going to give you Cisco marketing ease, but the fact of the matter is I know exactly one good way to do automation today. And that is to start leveraging intelligence and context about the environment. Intelligence is the global picture, what I know globally that's going on, and we have that picture, right? And context, the local picture of what your environment looks like, how it's being utilized, and how it's changing, so that we can have security infrastructure that knows what it's protecting, not because your operations team is telling it and trying to keep it updated on a daily basis, but because it understands the environment and it's actually communicating amongst itself about the big picture of what's going on in its local environment, where the devices are, users and apps, how they're changing, and what implications that has for their configuration and operation, as well as being able to figure out which events are important in our in the environment. So the mantra here is faster time to detection and faster time to remediation. Being able to do those sorts of things is hugely valuable and hugely important. So hit the next slide. And I think there's 3 builds on this one, so 1, 2, 3. One more. There you go. I didn't realize I wasn't going to have my own clicker up here today. So this is kind of the way that we're structuring things where I work. But I think generically, this is an appropriate architecture to talk about and reference. I'm not trying to give you kind of the, just the Cisco view of the world. This is in a lot of ways my view of the world because, I've had this real progression. When I first got to the company via the SourceFire acquisition, we were all about being best of breed at SourceFire. It was all best of breed all the time. This is important to our customers, and it was important for us as a smaller company to be able to go in and say, we are the fastest, best protecting, hardest to evade network-based security solution out there. We have the most powerful, most advanced malware and file reputation system available today, and be able to back that up. It was hugely important. But what I found when I got to Cisco was that as I started talking to CIOs and I started talking to customers and CISOs and things like that, there was a tremendous amount of hunger to simplify things, to have more effective security that didn't rely on people every step of the way to make everything happen because it wasn't scaling, it wasn't fast enough, it wasn't effective enough. Despite, I joke around, I say, I spent $50 million on security infrastructure and all I got was this lousy vendor t-shirt, right? Despite the fact that we have all the stuff, it's not getting better because we haven't come up with effective ways to do fundamental automation of the infrastructure. Fundamental stuff like recommending policies for tuning a security infrastructure for fundamental configuration of it. Being able to describe what your site security policy looks like, what your compliance needs look like, and what the global picture of security looks like. Being able to describe those things and having the system being able to automatically recommend a policy, a configuration to you. And as the world changes, whether it's new intel about threats comes in or your network changes as it does every day, every minute of the day, all that's running through these systems, and they recommend policy and posture changes to you based on what we see occurring in the real world. Doing impact assessment, just straight up frontline tier 1 analytics of, hey, a security event just happened. How much do I care? I guarantee you if you have analysts that are doing this manually, different people have different responses to the same event based on where they came from, their experience level, what they think they know about the operational environment, and so on and so forth. These are fundamental things. They're not automated today, barely at all. They're automated stuff that I built because I recognized this a while ago, but broadly they're not. And it's hugely important because if we're going to get better at doing security, we have to free up the teams to start thinking, not just dealing with a deluge of data all day, every day, coming out of these systems, and this insurmountable task of trying to manage the configurations of them and keep them relevant. So, this is the direction that we're headed down. The idea is to bring visibility together, let the infrastructure tell us about the environment, because everything's got a little piece of the puzzle. Your identity management system knows who's on what device. Our advanced malware system can tell you what software is installed on their device and what it's vulnerable to, what vulnerabilities you have based on the software you've got installed. The network-based systems that we've got can map the network. They can tell you which IP addresses are live and what operating systems are running, what protocols they speak, and what apps they're running. Right? They all have a little piece of the puzzle. What if we put all those puzzle pieces together in one thing, called it a visibility platform, and made some open APIs on it so everybody can contribute their viewpoint and everybody could build applications to leverage that access to that data. So, this is kind of where we're going right now. I'm not going to belabor the point, but automation is very, very difficult because it's not considered in ways that I believe are reasonable. Most automation today is just straight up correlation. Oh, I saw event A, B, and C happen, and the vulnerability management system ran a week ago, and it had this information about that device, and based on this, semi-stale data set, I'm going to make decisions about automation. You can't do that. You have to have a real-time platform that's always up to date. If you do it this way, you can actually make it work, and if you don't, it may or may not work very well. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, what we're really trying to drive to is this idea of simplicity at scale. SourceFire was all about scaling Snort. At Cisco, I've realized what we're really about is scaling security, scaling broadly scoped security technology sets so that it is approachable. This is a solvable problem. Because the path that we're on right now of 1,000 vendors with 1,000 solutions and 50 different management platforms in your environment, all these different ways of describing what good and bad look like and things like that, we can't do that because I can't honestly go in and sell that forever to people. We have to consolidate. Fewer platforms that do more stuff, that are more accessible, that are much more heavily automated, and that share global intelligence about what we know so that you're not operating as an island and so your technologies aren't operating as an island, and making this available to everybody. So it's not just like Cisco Blue, it's via open APIs, so anybody can write their own automation on top of it and anybody can contribute to the puzzle. And you know, this openness, you're probably thinking, oh, the Cisco guy is talking about open, what's something new under the sun? I come from open source, right? I wrote Snort, one of the biggest open source security projects on the planet. And we brought this thinking into Cisco with us when we did the SourceFire acquisition. And there's a real appetite for it now. So being able to drive these open APIs and drive these open initiatives so everybody can benefit from this approach, I think is also important. Because it shouldn't just be us that can benefit from this, it should be everybody that can benefit from it. So that's, you know, that's what we're doing today, and this is kind of, you know, the journey that I've been on to get there. So I see I've got about 6 minutes left, so I'd be happy to take some questions if anybody's got them.
Do you think latent viruses like Conficker are a threat to the viability of the internet? How resilient do you think the internet would be to a large-scale attack on the internet itself?
Great question. How resilient do I think the internet would be to a large-scale attack on the internet itself? I think the interconnections between the autonomous systems could be at risk. I think the internal structure of a lot of these large networks, I think, could be fairly resilient. It really depends about who you're talking about and where they are and kind of all the other pieces of the puzzle. If somebody were to launch like a pervasive attack against the routing infrastructure, for example, or do some of these BGP tricks that could be done out there, I think it's possible you could have a short-term disruption of the internet. I don't think it'd be possible to have long-term disruptions because you know, this resiliency and robustness that's built into a lot of these big telecom and service provider networks is sufficient to be able to quickly address the problem, essentially. I think large-scale compromises are certainly possible. I'm really fascinated by what's going to happen with ransomware right now because you've got kind of this perfect storm of the impulse to greed with, you know, sophisticated hacking techniques and really going after the thing that everybody needs, which is access to their devices and access to their data. And so that's really interesting. These large-scale you know, internet-wide attacks for targeting the internet itself, you know, the problem is kind of like attacking the power system. Yeah, you can attack the power system, maybe you can even take down the power grid, but then the internet turns off. You know, if you turn off the internet, then you've got no more internet. And that, you know, whose purposes does that serve apart from maybe nation states in the face of an attack or a terrorist or something like that? But I think those are short-term things, and they're a lot more intellectual than, you know, than maybe your terrorist element would go after, but maybe not so in the case of a nation-state attacker that was using as a precursor to a surprise attack or something like that. But I think you're much more likely, from a security standpoint, to see these financially driven attacks become a real problem for everybody for the next few years. And obviously, we think we're doing some pretty interesting things against them. Next question.
We have time for one additional question, and that question is, what can DoD learn from the adaptation of your technologies within a larger enterprise?
What can DoD learn from our adaptation, from the adaptation of our technologies in the larger enterprise? You know, this is, I'm gonna speak to my own biases here a little bit. So one of the things that I've been witnessing, and one of the big problems that I'm really seeing is that, so as chief architect, you know, I've been tasked with building an architecture. And building an architecture is building a set of technologies that interoperate with each other effectively and usefully and things like that, so that you get a lot of bang for your buck and simplicity at scale and things of that nature, which, you know, I believe are very important. But here's the problem, and you know, this is a known problem. People don't buy security architectures. People buy security projects. So I've got an NGFW project, I've got an endpoint security project, I've got an analytics project, and the problem with that model of purchasing and that mode of buying is that it ignores the reality of coming up with viable, integrable architectures. You can't integrate things together that were never meant to be integrated together apart from what everybody ends up doing, which is dumping it all into Splunk and, you know, building apps on top of that. That's the level of integration that most enterprises have across their data sets. And it's counterproductive to being able to have a security architecture that gives you a defensible network environment so that if you do bring on incremental capabilities, you have a lot more capability reserve in your environment, right? So if I can sell you a very broadly scoped solution that solves a lot of the 80-20 problems, right? There's a bunch of 80-20 problems around DDoS and email and threat protection and host-based protection and things like that. If I can sell you one big integrated architecture that can do that versus you going out and buying a bunch of best-of-breed solutions and doing a project-driven approach to doing security, you're going to end up with fundamentally better security because you'll still have more headroom available to go out and buy some of these incremental solutions, but nobody buys like that. So I think there's a lesson there for everybody, which is to think about your buying behaviors. And I'm not just saying, there's several architectures out there. You don't just have to buy it from me, obviously. Make me happy if you did. But we have to face up to the fact that the model that we're on, the integration model that we're on, and the operational model that we're on is not scaling and will never scale, and is becoming less and less resilient in the face of the attackers that's out there. So if that's the case, we really have to think about how we're going to change the game. And it's not a technological solution. It's actually a purchasing problem. How we actually go about buying and provisioning these security technologies. And it's probably a little bit of a surprising thing for you to hear from me, but there's all sorts of really interesting business model problems here that need to be addressed because that drives behaviors, and that drives purchasing, and that defeats the purpose of having these architectures if we can never get past the current model of how purchasing is done and how projects are evaluated. And I'm not just saying back up the truck and throw out all your other gear and just bring in Cisco. I'm saying think about the future as you're going down the road. Are you going to have solutions that are possible to integrate together? Or are you just going to be back in the data dump and putting it all together in some big data analytics platform and crossing your fingers that you never need to be more than that? All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And I think I will turn it back over here.
Well, we certainly thank Marty for his time, his attention to the topics that we're discussing here. It's remarkable to see an engineer who's built products and now has brought it forward into a very large enterprise like Cisco to describe not only the challenges but the solutions they're pursuing. I just think it's thought leadership, and it's exactly the right note to set as we think about not just the problem but our future and get near the close of our event. So Marty, on behalf of you, we're going to present a gift to the Fisher House to aid our wounded and our fallen warriors' families. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, we're now moving into a networking break during which final set of theater sessions are available and will be presented in the theaters on the exhibit floor. And at luncheon today at 1 o'clock, we'll feature an address by Vice Admiral Jan Tai, Commander of U.S. Fleet, 10th Fleet. If you haven't had a chance to hear her speak and frankly address this transformation of the Navy's platforms into the information warfare set, I think you'll find it tremendous. As a reminder, today's luncheon is your final opportunity to sit with engaged senior leaders at the designated tables. And the symposium will conclude after Admiral Tai's presentation with a meet and greet on the L Street Bridge and a presentation for the DISA leadership in an informal setting. Enjoy the break, and the theaters will see you, and at the theaters, and we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.